Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. We've got some breaking news tonight, an exclusive all-in scoop. It's this. Donald Trump is 78 years old. Did you know that? If elected, he will be the oldest person to ever be sworn in as president of the United States. He is a man that is suffering from, I think, pretty obvious mental decline. But in contrast to the breathless coverage of Joe Biden's age and fitness, which, again, made a certain amount of sense, prior to his dropping out of the presidential race, we are not seeing nearly as much discussion about Trump's diminished mental acuity. When was the last time you read an article wondering if Trump was mentally fit to be president of the United States? It is simply not leading the coverage of this race as it was with Biden 2 months ago. It seems like everyone's grading Trump on a curve. He has always been rambling and incoherent, true, so he gets a pass. But I got to say, if you spend any amount of time listening to him these days, and for our sins we do here at All In, he does not sound like a person who should be anywhere near the nuclear codes.
The transgender thing is incredible. Think of it. Your kid goes to school and comes home a few days later with an operation. The school decides what's going to happen with your child. And, you know, many of these childs 15 years later say, what the hell happened? Who did this to me?
The real radicals on that issue are the Democrats, where you can have an abortion in the 9th month, and in 6 states, you're allowed to kill the baby after the baby is born. The execution of a baby, because that's not abortion, that's the execution of a baby. You could actually execute the baby after birth. The wind, it kills our birds. If you want to see a bird cemetery, go under a windmill sometime. They do kill a hell of a lot of birds. Why do they love it? It kills all the birds.
Now, these are all obvious and transparent lies. I don't think any serious person believes any of that. Like, you drop your kid off at school at 8:30 in the morning and then pick them up at 2:30, and they've had gender-affirming surgery in the school that day in the nurse's office. No one is executing babies in 6 states or any states. It's not legal in democratic states to, the doctor just kills the child there, the newborn. There aren't piles of dead birds under all the windmills. Again, the guy just says stuff. But I guess what I would say about that, and he's been saying stuff for a long time, is more and more I generally can't tell if he believes it or not himself. Like, is there a line anymore between deception and delusion? And if you actually ask him to articulate just a basic policy proposal, say on childcare, for instance, he just cannot do it.
If you win in November, can you commit to prioritizing legislation to make childcare affordable? And if so, what specific piece of legislation will you advance?
Well, I would do that, and we're sitting down. You know, I was we had Senator Marco Rubio, and my daughter Ivanka was so impactful on that issue. It's a very important issue. But I think when you talk about the kind of numbers that I'm talking about, that, because look, childcare is childcare. There's something, you have to have it. In this country, you have to have it. But when you talk about those numbers compared to the kind of numbers that I'm talking about, by taxing foreign nations at levels that they're not used to, but they'll get used to it very quickly. And it's not going to stop them from doing business with us, but they'll have a very substantial tax when they send product into our country. Those numbers are so much bigger than any numbers that we're talking about, including childcare, that it's going to take care. We're going to have, I look forward to having no deficits within a fairly short period of time, coupled with the reductions that I told you about on waste and fraud and all of the other things that are going on in our country. Because I have to stay with childcare. I want to stay with childcare, but those numbers are small relative to the kind of economic numbers that I'm talking about, including growth, but growth also headed up by what the plan is that I just told you about. We're going to be taking in trillions of dollars, and as much as child care is talked about as being expensive, it's, relatively speaking, not very expensive compared to the kind of numbers we'll be taking in. We're going to make this into an incredible country that can afford to take care of its people, and then we'll worry about the rest of the world. Let's help other people. But we're going to take care of our country first. This is about America first. It's about make America great again. We have to do it because right now we're a failing nation. So we'll take care of it. Thank you.
The applaud at the end. After he's like falling all over, he does a Simone Biles dismount. MAGA. You get all that? Remember, the question was, what specific piece of legislation will you advance to keep child care costs down? Okay? Now, again, here's a contrast. Here's the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris. She's the Democratic nominee. Here she is with her specific plan to help offset the cost of child care.
Under my plan, more than 100 million Americans will get a tax cut, and we will do this by restoring 2 tax cuts designed to help middle-class and working Americans: the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit. Through which millions of Americans with children got to keep more of their hard-earned income. So as president, I'll not only restore that tax cut, but expand it. We will provide $6,000 in tax relief to families during the first year of a child's life.
So there you have it. A little bit of a contrast. Now, you know, in Trump's defense, he was not on teleprompter. He was just riffing there. But I don't know, man. That's the quality of the brains right now that we got over there.
The Harris campaign on offense with this new ad hammering Trump for Project 2025. We're going to show you some of that ad in just a moment. It reinforces the attack the campaign hit nightly at the convention, which is trying to take what is now politically seen as widely a very toxic Project 2025 and tie it to Trump, brand him with it, link him to it. You could even say the Harris campaign wants to yoke 2025 to the Trump-Vance ticket for these remaining 60-plus days. And to show voters their view that Trump has extremist positions on everything from women's rights to selling out to billionaires, which is a point Harris is explicitly hitting when she's been out on the trail this week.
He plans to give billionaires massive tax cuts and to cut corporate taxes by over $1 trillion, even as they pull in record profits. His plans will add more than $5 trillion to the national debt. He also wants to impose what in effect is a national sales tax. And that is on top of the $2 trillion tax cut. We know how to count. We know how to count.
And if you're counting, Harris has had a pretty busy schedule as compared to Trump lately, while his running mate, J.D. Vance, if you're counting, is doing a rally in Phoenix, Arizona at this very hour. As you see here, some of the preparations, while Harris's running mate, Walz, will be doing his rally in Pennsylvania. Preparations underway, people gathered. And if you are counting, we're just 5 days out from the debate in Pennsylvania. Harris headed there for prep today. She arrived in Pittsburgh and was greeted by Senator Fetterman and his wife. Harris is practicing with the Democratic operative who's been playing Trump in debate prep all the way back to 2016. Philippe Reines, who is known for getting into character. He wears a red tie. He does the Trump-like lunges. He did this for Hillary Clinton. As for the 2025 attack, which I mentioned, many Democrats want Harris to advance that attack about Project 2025 on that highly watched debate stage. So I mentioned that new Harris ad, which is running on TV and the internet. Here is a clip.
Trump's Project 2025 agenda will give him unchecked political power with no guardrails, and it would take Black America backwards. Project 2025 would strip away our voting rights protections, and it eliminates the Department of Education. It would also require states to monitor women's pregnancies. It bans abortion and would rip away health coverage for millions.
Now, Trump officials insist they do not back the 2025 policies. Several of them have told us that right here on The Beat. Why do so many parts of the Republican platform overlap with 25? And we can put examples on the screen for you, including, as I think you know, abortion.
It's very simple. President Trump has said he has nothing to do with Project 2025. There are a lot of groups out there on both the right and the left who come up with policy initiatives.
What do you say to people who can read these two things and say, okay, Trump and the platform are basically 25 on abortion?
Look, I know nothing about Project 2025.
Project 2025 has absolutely nothing to do with the past, present, or future. President Trump and President Trump alone will make his own policies.
Heritage does such an incredible job, and they're going to lay the groundwork and detail plans for exactly what our movement will do.
And that's the history. Trump has gone from touting Heritage, which wrote the thing, and saying they would do the blueprints, to distancing himself from it, and his aides say the same. Now, he's been campaigning on economic issues in New York today and trying to energize the base with this town hall on Fox News with Sean Hannity that aired last night. I can tell you it drew a strong 3.2 million viewers live, but it was actually not even the most watched hour on Fox last night. Trump used the appearance to hit his campaign themes. He talked immigration. He talked foreign policy. He did a kind of a pre-attack on ABC's fairness for next week's debate, something that I was touching on with my colleague Nicole Wallace a moment ago. And then Donald Trump brought up his concern and his objection to these attacks that his running mate is weird.
JD is not weird. He's a solid rock. I happen to be a very solid rock. We're not weird. We're other things, perhaps, but we're not weird. We're not weird guys. We're very solid people.
We're not weird guys. We're not weird. We're not weird. It's interesting to see Donald Trump, for whatever reasons, and everyone can draw their own conclusions, but kind of break one of the first rules of communications and PR, which is if you're being accused of something that you're not, you don't repeat that thing, weird or whatever it may be, 3 times over. But this is Donald Trump. Maybe he is off a step. Maybe he is tired. He certainly has fewer events. Or maybe he just feels an instinct to just say over and over, he's not weird, not weird, not weird. And if people in the Harris campaign celebrate the idea that calling them weird has gotten them saying the word weird, well, so be it. It's politics. Now, this debate matters a ton. You don't even really need to be convinced of that. We just had a single presidential debate in this cycle, and it upended everything and actually changed the nominee and led to the latest exit of a presidential candidate who was in the White House ever in American history. People are going to come back for the next debate, and it's fall. More people are following politics than in sleepy August. So Harris's approach will matter, and Donald Trump, make no mistake, has done effective work in many debates previously, and he's done more national debates than her, and it's not unlike any other difficult thing. Practice is relevant. Harris has her own practice, not against Trump, not on the national stage in the same way, but on the Democrats' stage. So take a look at how she has previewed some of what she wants to do now that she has the ball. This was back from the 2020 presidential campaign cycle at a 2019 debate.
First, I have a few words for Donald Trump. You have used hate, intimidation, fear, and over 12,000 lies as a way to distract from your failed policies and your broken promises. I plan on focusing on our common issues, our common hopes and desires, and in that way unifying our country. President Trump, you can go back to watching Fox News.
Ta-da. That was an ABC debate in the primary. She will be bringing some of that energy, presumably, to this ABC debate for the general election next week. What a difference 5 years makes. There's also concrete measures of Harris's momentum. And I've told you, you can look at these national polls if you want. We don't cover them on the beat because there is no national election. There's an electoral college. So you have to look at the states and other pieces of evidence. Fundraising in modern American politics matters, and it's also a clue about enthusiasm among the base, which matters for volunteering and for turnout. Harris, we can tell you, is raising over $300 million in August alone, according to what she's told NBC through her campaign. It doubles Trump's expected haul. New reporting shows the momentum also has forced the Trump campaign to find different and new, more conservative or more safe approaches to the electoral map because, quote, the Trump path to victory is narrowing, Axios reporting his campaign now pulling back from New Hampshire, Minnesota, Virginia, and instead refocusing on North Carolina, Arizona, Nevada, where he had significant polling leads before Harris made them competitive, end quote. Now, let me give you the very clear translation. Numbers had showed Donald Trump could be winning those states over Biden handily. Now, those same states, according to this nonpartisan reporting, are, quote, competitive, to the degree that Harris might even take some of them. A competitive close race is the marker for the intensity of this debate. And that's a tougher environment for Trump than the last debate, where he and his aides seemed very confident about his chances against Biden and were literally putting resources and energy into those other states that now, again, an indication of strategy they're pulling back from. That doesn't mean Harris is going to win. I don't want you to run out and say, hey, I saw in the news they said Trump's pulling back, she's winning. It means that the strategy is changing, that his map is narrowing, But the Democrats also know that they have a narrow map. You hear a lot about the blue wall because they see some paths here and there, but they don't see 10 different ways to win. This is a tight race. Tighter than it was when Biden was the nominee. That's bad for Trump. But still very, very tight, which is a challenge for Harris. Now, as she thinks about what she wants to do, there are all the echoes of 2020. It is taken for granted sometimes that Kamala Harris is part of the winning Biden-Harris coalition, right? She met the coalition in 2020 that way. She ran on the national stage, and she did fight the MAGA message against then-incumbent Vice President Pence.
I'm pro-life. I don't apologize for it.
I will always fight for a woman's right to make a decision about her own body.
I couldn't be more proud to serve as vice president to a president who stands without apology for the sanctity of human life.
It should be her decision and not that of Donald Trump and the vice president, Michael Pence.
Kamala Harris then, before she assumed the vice presidency, taking on the vice president. And she was effective. And Pence, for his part, like Trump, had a lot of experience at that point, doing these debates and such, but she got where she needed to go. And another point as we look to what she might do in next week's debate. There's been many articles written, and the convention showed that she does not talk up her own identity a lot. She does not say, vote for me because I'm this or that, member of this or that group. But at the same token, as a former prosecutor, she does not shy away from hard conversations. It has nothing to do with Kamala Harris's identity that Donald Trump appeals to white supremacists in general. He's been doing that long before she was the nominee. And she does not mince words when it comes to the fact that Donald Trump, through Proud Boys, through white supremacists, through his well-known documented record of statements, not all of which I'm going to repeat right here, that is fact, that has to be confronted when you're at a debate.
We are talking about an election in 27 days, where last week the President of the United States took a debate stage in front of 70 million Americans and refused to condemn white supremacists.
Not true.
And
not true.
It wasn't like he didn't have a chance. He didn't do it, and then he doubled down. And then he said, when pressed, stand back, stand by.
It is becoming the Noah's Ark of American politics, a coalition whose passengers climb on board 2 by 2. It includes Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders, as well as Republican Adam Kinzinger and, as of last night, the former number 3 House Republican with a last name practically synonymous with what the conservative Republican Party in its most strictly conservative iteration used to be all about. All of them now in the same boat to save democracy from a disgraced, convicted, twice impeached, 4 times indicted ex-president with a fondness for dictators abroad and a yearning to be one right here at home in America. All this critical post-Labor Day at this critical juncture in the 2024 campaign, conservative stalwart January 6th committee vice chair Liz Cheney announcing that she will vote for Vice President Kamala Harris for president. Here's that moment.
Because we're here in North Carolina, I think it is crucially important for people to recognize not only is what I've just said about the danger that Trump poses something that should prevent people from voting for him, but I don't believe that we have the luxury of writing in candidates' names, particularly in swing states. And as a conservative, as someone who believes in and cares about the Constitution, I have thought deeply about this. And because of the danger that Donald Trump poses, not only am I not voting for Donald Trump, but I will be voting for Kamala Harris in this election.
The Harris campaign responding to that moment, that endorsement, saying this, quote, the vice president is proud to have earned Congresswoman Cheney's vote. She's a patriot who loves this country and puts our democracy and our Constitution first. For any American who is looking to reject the chaos and division of Donald Trump, to turn the page and pursue a new way forward that protects our freedoms and defends the American values we all believe in, there's a place for you in the Harris-Walz coalition, and we will continue working to earn your support. Liz Cheney adding her high-profile name to a growing list of current and former Republicans whose assessment of the stakes of this election have led to one inescapable conclusion: their support for the Democratic presidential nominee. Now, for Cheney herself, who supported Donald Trump in 2016 and 2020, her breaking point was, of course, the January 6th insurrection. Here's what she said on the eve of Trump's trial in the U.S. Senate.
What we already know does constitute the gravest violation of his oath of office by any president in the history of the country. And this is not something that we can simply look past or pretend didn't happen or try to move on.
And it was comments like that that cost her her political career. And unlike just about all of her colleagues in the GOP who saw it the same way, who we know now from great reporting and some hot mic moments clearly understood Donald Trump's culpability and role in inciting the deadly insurrection, they either didn't have the appetite to pay a political price or didn't have the courage to defy the ex-president. But Liz Cheney helped drive the congressional investigation that uncovered so much of what we now know about the Trump coup plot, and all of it, again, at the cost of her own role in House leadership and eventually her seat in Congress.
Be there, he instructed them. Will be wild. As you will see, this was a pivotal moment. This tweet initiated a chain of events. The tweet led to the planning for what occurred on January 6th, including by the Proud Boys, who ultimately led the invasion of the Capitol and the violence on that day.
His response was to say they can march to the Capitol from the ellipse.
Something to the effect of, take the effing mags away, they're not here to hurt me, let them in, let my people in. They can march to the Capitol after the rally's over.
Donald Trump made a purposeful choice to violate his oath of office, to ignore the ongoing violence against law enforcement, to threaten our constitutional order. There is no way to excuse that behavior.
Now, what's politically important is that Cheney becomes a really critical part of what's been coined by pollsters and political analysts of a permission structure for other voters who might see themselves in part of Liz Cheney's story and then go on to pull the lever and vote for Vice President Kamala Harris in November. Here's a little bit more of what Cheney said last night at Duke University.
I think that it is crucially important, and I would say especially to my fellow conservatives, that we think about the stakes and that we think about the extent to which we have a duty to put our country and our Constitution above partisanship. We all have that duty and responsibility.
A vote for Kamala Harris as an act of duty and patriotism. That coming from Liz Cheney is where we start today with some of our favorite experts and friends. Former Republican Congressman, now an MSNBC political analyst, David Jolly's here, plus political strategist and MSNBC senior analyst Matt Dowd is here. We start, though, with former January 6th Select Committee member, Democratic Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren of California. Congresswoman, your thoughts to Liz Cheney's endorsement of Vice President Kamala Harris yesterday?
Well, I'm proud of Liz. You know, we worked very hard together on the January 6th committee. She and I are not the same politically. She's a conservative Republican. I'm not. There are a lot of policy issues we don't agree on. But one thing we do agree on is the rule of law and protecting the Constitution. And that's why we worked so hard on the January 6th committee. And I think her statement is going to be important for a lot of people. She is so steeped in the Republican Party. I remember there were meetings that we would have during the January 6th committee, and we were in a conference room, and as we were sitting there, I looked on the wall and I realized there was a picture of her father, and the president on the wall. Well, I mean, that's her roots. She is so Republican, and that she would say the only way to honor our Constitution is not just to not vote for Trump, but to vote for the only real alternative, Kamala Harris, is significant. And I think it's brave on the part of Liz. And once again, something I deeply respect about her.
I love everything that you're saying. And it's important to point out that, you know, I worked for her father and George W. Bush, and I was a squish. I was a squishy California Republican. Matt Dowd can attest to that. They were not. And there were lots of instances where, you know, I was sort of viewed, not distrustfully, but skeptically by folks closer to the Cheneys on the ideological spectrum. What seems to have developed, though, and really been punctuated by the vice president's convention, especially that fourth night when she formally accepted the nomination, is that a vote for Harris and all of these Republican endorsers are making an argument that it's the only patriotic thing to do, that it is unpatriotic at this point to support Donald Trump. What do you think about that coming from Liz, who has the goods and the receipts because of her role on the Select Committee?
Well, I think it's obviously true. And Adam Kinzinger actually spoke at the convention, making the same. You know, Trump knew he lost the election. He's actually just recently admitted that on a podcast. He summoned a mob to Washington. He knew they were armed, and he sent them to the Capitol to overturn the election. I mean, what could be more unpatriotic than that? He wanted to overthrow the vote and upend our Constitution. There's no way to square that with the rule of law and patriotism. As Liz said in her statement, this has never happened before in American history, where we had a president who refused to honor his oath in this way. And so for those who are focusing on policy issues, you know, the policy issues can ultimately be solved. But if we don't have a democracy, there's no vehicle for solving them. So that's really what's at stake here.
Joining us now, Ian Sams, Senior National Spokesperson for the Harris-Walz campaign, former White House official. Hey, Ian, it's great to see you. Thank you. I want to ask you, how is Vice President Harris preparing for this debate? Is she doing mocks in Pittsburgh now as well?
Look, she's preparing for this debate to share her vision of the country with the American people. A lot of times this might be the first time a lot of people hear from her on a debate stage. You know, I think you mentioned the fact that the Trump campaign insisted on having the microphones muted in the debate on Tuesday night. I think that you can see that that's clearly a concentrated effort by President Trump to create a parameter to let him be more disciplined and more careful in his approach. I think people might be underestimating his ability in the debate, given the structure and format of those muted microphones. You know, he lies so much that it's hard to fact check him in real time, whether you're a moderator or a candidate running against him. And so I think his handlers worked really hard to make sure that those mics stay muted to put him in a better position to be successful. I mean, this is his 7th general election presidential debate, probably the most of anybody in history. And Donald Trump's a showman, so we know he's going to come in ready to debate. And the vice president is preparing very hard to share with the country her vision for a new way forward and the very significant differences between she and President Trump in this campaign.
Well, you and the vice president know better than anyone, other than Joe Biden, how important, how significant these confrontations can be, for good or not. James Carville, Democratic guru, has suggested that she ought to be getting under his skin. And clearly what is working for you so far in the last couple of weeks is her ridicule, not taking his taunts seriously, sort of dismissing him and all of his disparaging insults, that she's not intelligent, and the remarks about gender, which she didn't respond to in that one-on-one interview. Is that the game plan, to just kind of dismiss him and prompt him to go off message, prompt him to be less disciplined?
Well, I think what's really challenging and unfortunate about this debate format is that it it limits the vice president's ability to prosecute the political case against President Trump. People remember so clearly in the Senate when she would have Trump officials or judicial nominees in front of the Judiciary Committee, the way she's able to incisively question someone to try to draw out the truth and really put facts on the table. Unfortunately, because of the insistence by Trump's campaign to have the microphones muted, up to what we believe was threatening to pull out of the debate, we thought the debate was more important to have so the American people can see the choice. But it is unfortunate that she won't be able to go after him with that sort of prosecutorial line of questioning to hold him accountable in this debate. We know he's going to try to mislead the country about where he stands. We know he's going to push negative attacks on the vice president. But, you know, she's going to be ready to tell the American people the truth, to respond to his claims about her, and to share her vision with the country. But I think it does create a challenge that we aren't going to be able to have the ability to sort of go directly at these claims made by President Trump, or to try to hold him accountable for his own misstatements and, frankly, offensive sort of attacks against her.
Now, former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney, famously, of course, the co-chair of the January 6th investigation, just endorsed Kamala Harris last night. Here's what she had to say at Duke University.
I don't believe that we have the luxury of writing in candidates' names, particularly in swing states. And as a conservative, as someone who believes in and cares about the Constitution, I have thought deeply about this. And because of the danger that Donald Trump poses, not only am I not voting for Donald Trump, but I will be voting for Kamala Harris in this election.
How do you think that the Liz Cheney endorsement might help you?
Well, look, Congresswoman Cheney is a patriot, and I think in the last 5 years, we've seen over and over again her put country over party, or as John McCain would say, to put country first. And I think that the vice president really respects these Republicans, these true conservatives who are having the courage to speak out and to say that what we see from President Trump is unacceptable, and we can't select him in this election. We have to choose a new way forward. We have to turn the page on what he has represented, the chaos, the division, the erosion of our freedoms and constitutional ideals. You know, she welcomes the support of anyone in this country who is tired of what President Trump is offering. And I think that she's offering a big, bold, inclusive vision for any voter, whether you're on the right, left, or somewhere in between, to support her. And so, you know, we think that this is momentum that we can keep up right now with Republicans who are speaking up and coming out and saying that they're going to support Vice President Harris. We welcome them in this campaign, and we hope this is a campaign that they can believe in.
Joining us now, Washington Post national political reporter Isaac Arnsdorf. I'm hoping it's whomever and not whoever. I can't think that quickly on the fly about my grammar. Isaac, thanks for being with us. So in this debate prep, both sides want to say the other is the one with the old ideas. How are they able to do that when both of them have had prominent places at the White House? Donald Trump was the incumbent 4 years ago. Vice President Harris is the vice president.
Yeah, and you know, Trump has been making this point a lot with every promise that Harris has been making. You know, why didn't she already do it in power? And Harris in turn has been saying, you know, we want to turn the page on the past decade, which includes Trump's presidency, but also the presidency of Biden, who she's serving with. And so that does tell you a lot about what voters want to hear. You know, something that stands out to me is with this kind of breath of fresh air pursuit is the way that the Harris campaign has been really more focused on positive ads and contrast ads rather than attacking Trump, which you had thought about being the Democratic default for ever since he's been the Republican standard bearer. So that really tells you that they are leaning into, you know, not talking about Trump so much, you know, the sense that there's some Trump fatigue, and actually their opportunity is to offer a fresh face and a new alternative. And it's actually the Trump campaign and the Trump super PACs that have been more focused on attacking Harris and trying to bring down her favorable ratings when, you know, views of her among Americans are a lot less hardwired than they are of Trump or they were of Biden.
What about President Biden? I mean, how much does Harris need to distinguish herself from him? Does she have to cut from him in distinct ways in order to make herself that fresh face?
Well, it's a little bit delicate with, you know, not wanting to undermine the sitting president who she still serves with. But the polling has indicated that actually voters don't overly associate her with Biden's existing policies, that they sort of are giving her that chance to define herself. So far, obviously, the Trump campaign is working hard against that. You know, their messaging has been very explicit about trying to make Harris responsible for everything that Biden has done. I mean, really just like swapping out one name or the other for criticisms of the exact same policies.
All right, we have Vaughn Hilliard, who's joining us, NBC News correspondent. So, Vaughn, Donald Trump wanted the mics to stay off, didn't want to change the rules. He got his way. ABC News is going to keep the mics off when the candidate's not speaking, their mic is off. But he's still complaining about the rules, and he's complaining about ABC. Let's play a moment from him last night on Fox News with Sean Hannity.
When they said that they wanted to change the rules that they had agreed to, did they ask for notes? Did they ask for the...
They wanted notes.
They wanted to be seated, and they wanted your mic hot.
And they wanted a desk. They didn't want to do... I said, you got to do a stand-up.
After they already agreed to the other.
Yeah, but they wanted a desk from the beginning.
Vaughn, complaining. It's kind of his modus operandi.
And ultimately, the campaign got what they wanted, and this is what the Biden campaign had agreed to back in June. And look, I don't know whether Donald Trump wanted these rules or whether his campaign wanted the rules. The Harris team was trying to poke the bear by, you know, almost like provoking him online to say his advisors were trying to muzzle him from being able to speak out. And ultimately, as you heard here, he is throwing a lot of other, let's be very frank, gibberish out there. One of those examples is that he is suggesting last night on Hannity that the Harris campaign, that they wanted to actually, I'm losing my train of thought.
So he was suggesting that the Harris team was going to get the questions.
Correct.
Because Harris has a relationship with somebody at the top of ABC News, and the foundation that he has there, and this is why this is one of those misleading statements that could work, is that there was a case where Donna Brazile admitted to doing that in 2016, or some version of that. So there's like a seed of truth to something happening in the past, and now he's using that, exploiting it to make it seem like ABC News will be trying to tip the scale in Harris's favor. ABC News has said they are not. None of the candidates are going to be getting the questions. That's pretty standard.
Right. And there's no reason to believe. It's unsubstantiated. It's unfounded. Donald Trump has nothing yet. If he goes and throws that out to the right-wing ecosystem there, right, folks are going to believe it. And you mentioned the Donna Brazile. Back in 2016, the hacked DNC emails revealed that when she was a contributor at CNN, that she had suggested to the Clinton campaign some of the potential topics that may be brought up at a town hall. She apologized in the aftermath of all of that. It wasn't a debate, but, you know, it kind of all gets mumble-jumbled together here. And for Donald Trump, he uses that seed of that one particular thing. They were not questions. They were potential topics. And to suggest that the debate next week, that Kamala Harris is going to have all the questions sent to her, which, of course, we have no reason to believe that's the case. And the other part is last night on Hannity, he was suggesting that Kamala Harris, the vice president, cannot complete a sentence. So he is setting the bar low for her. Of course, he did that back in June. And he is confident and believes that he is the best position to go and be able to make the case to the American public in a way that he is able to effectively do, that he's the better one position to take the White House.
We were talking about this with Isaac. Who's going to be able to paint the other as the incumbent? How is Donald Trump going to try to go after that? A lot of the policies that he is proposing are the same ones that he had in place in 2016, 2017.
Exactly. And I mean, as part of this here is when we're talking about, I actually was just 8 blocks down the road, ran over here from Midtown Manhattan. He was speaking to the Economic Club of New York. And
you're not out of breath.
And
incredible shape, my
friend. A lot of the policy proposals that Donald Trump is putting forward are to rescind what the Biden-Harris administration did, right? Rescind the tax credits for electric vehicles, roll back the carbon emission standards, right? To go back to implementing tariffs, 10 to 20% tariffs on all imported goods. And he was making the case to these CEOs, hedge fund managers at this prominent economic club just a few moments ago that the economy under the Trump administration was great up until the pandemic, and now Biden and Harris are trying to take credit for everything that they have done, showing all the numbers, overinflating them because the numbers went so down during the pandemic. And so essentially he's trying to butt up in pre-butt what he can expect Kamala Harris to make on Tuesday's debate. So they'll both use the incumbency when it's convenient.
There's so much anticipation for this because the last debate blew up the Biden campaign. What's this debate going to be like? Especially, and this is always surprising to me, even though I've said it now a few times, Kamala Harris has never met Donald Trump. She's never spoken to him in person. The only time she's been in the same room as him is during a State of the Union. That's fascinating.
If I may, I covered Kamala Harris's 2019 presidential campaign day to day. And the discussion amongst us reporters was like, she would be so effective if she ever got the chance to go toe-to-toe with Donald Trump. When she was debating Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden, they were steeped in decades of policymaking, votes, right? They had identities. Their biographies were already well known. But when it came to the idea of prosecuting the case, she was eager to do it because she had a history dating back to California as the Attorney General. I had talked with old colleagues and friends of hers that had mentored her inside of the Alameda County, District Attorney's office that said that she was so effective in not only asking the tough questions, but also when she was able to talk to victims and highlight their own stories. When you have both of those together, that is a part that I think most humans, right? There's an emotional side, and then there is also the exacting mathematical side. And not often in politics do we see somebody who is able to balance both of those. And I think that this is really a moment for Kamala Harris where she is going to be able to effectively, potentially, show that, or at least that's what her allies hope.
Yvonne Hilliard, thank you very much. That is extremely interesting. Isaac Arnsdorf, thank you as well.